Alexander Graham Bell. Do something useful. That's what the man had said, and young Alexander Graham Bell thought it was a good suggestion. But what could he do that was useful? All day Alexander had been playing with his friend Ben Herdman at the Herdman Mill in the countryside of Scotland. They'd had several rousing games of tag, they'd climbed up ladders and jumped off storage bins, and they'd looked for beetles and mice in the fields. Now they were having a race through the mill when Ben's father, who was grinding wheat into flour, finally lost his patience. "Do something useful," he scolded. "Like what?" the boys asked. Mr. Herdman held up a handful of wheat. "Like taking the husks off this wheat," he said. Alexander looked at the wheat, thought about it a moment, and came up with an idea. They could scrape the husks off with a nail brush. So together he and Ben sat themselves down with two nail brushes and began scraping. It worked. It worked very well, but it took forever. There's got to be a faster way, thought Alexander. Later, when he and Ben were wandering around the mill again, Alexander noticed a machine with rotating paddles that was no longer in use. What would happen, he wondered, if the paddles were lined with brushes or something else abrasive? Wouldn't they be able to scrape off the husks? Excited, the boys rushed to Ben's father and described their idea. The miller, partly to encourage their creativity, decided to give it a try. And sure enough, the simple machine quickly and efficiently separated the husk from the wheat. It was Alexander Graham Bell's first invention. There would be many more inventions before he was through, including instruments for the deaf and hearing impaired, the hydrofoil, and his most famous invention of all, the telephone. Do something useful was a commandment he lived up to for his entire life. Alexander Graham Bell was born March 3rd in the year 1847, the same year his fellow inventor Thomas Edison was born. The generation to which Bell and Edison belonged was a remarkable generation, full of bold entrepreneurs and creative geniuses. They would help usher in the technological age that would eventually change the daily life of almost every person on Earth. In the first 50 years after Bell was born, inventors and scientists discovered, among many other things, the sewing machine, the hypodermic syringe, electric light, the battery, the gas burner, pasteurization, the oil pipeline, dynamite, torpedoes, the bicycle, the typewriter, insulin, the phonograph, the microphone, celluloid film, radio waves, the pneumatic tire, antitoxins, the internal combustion engine, the automobile, X-rays, and the motion picture camera. Almost every year between 1850 and 1900, there was some dramatic discovery that further shifted us from the agricultural society we once knew to the industrial society we know today. It was exactly the right time for a boy and a man who wanted to do something useful. Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and was christened simply Alexander Bell. He adopted the name Graham from a family friend when he was 11, to distinguish himself from other Alexander Bells in his family tree. It was a distinguished family tree, filled with scholars, artists, and relatives dedicated to education and service. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was an expert and author in the field of speech and deafness, who taught deaf mutes to speak. He had created a technique called visible speech, a code of symbols that indicated the position of the throat, tongue, and lips in making sound. The deaf used these symbols in learning to reproduce speech. Alexander's grandfather was also an expert in speech, with a focus on drama. He was an actor, and later in life gave dramatic readings of Shakespeare. Bell's mother, Eliza Simmons, who was deaf, was a superb portrait painter and, in spite of her disability, a skilled pianist. Bell had two brothers, an older one named Melville, or Melly for short, who was especially charming and outgoing, and a younger one named Edward. Alexander, in the middle, was more shy and reserved. He spent long hours by himself, reading or exploring the countryside. His particular talent was music. He played by ear when he was just a toddler, and later he could sight read. He was so talented at the piano that he was given lessons by a renowned master from Edinburgh. For a while, everyone was quite sure that when Alexander Bell grew up, he would be a famous musician. The famous part, they were right about. The most important time of Alexander Bell's youth may have been the year he spent in London living with his grandfather. They shared the same name, the same birthday, and the same determined personality. Grandfather Bell knew of Alexander's low grades in school, and he also worried about his position as middle child. An insightful and compassionate man, he decided Alexander could use a year of special, undivided attention. In that year of special attention, Alexander blossomed from an unsure teenager into a confident and competent young man. Alexander and his grandfather read Shakespeare's plays together, memorizing and performing certain parts. His grandfather gave him lessons in elocution and delivery that had such a long-lasting effect that even late in life, people commented on Alexander Bell's distinct and compelling speech patterns. His grandfather also played piano with him, took him to plays, taught him how to write plays, and instructed him in the science of acoustics and sound, the special field of the Bell family. Alexander wrote a poem for his grandfather that read, "I am 13 years old, I find. Your birthday and mine are the same. I want to inherit your mind as well as your much-honored name." Alexander left his grandfather's house and returned home with a deep respect for the human faculty of speech and ability to communicate ideas, a respect that would be the basis for his life's work. In 1862, when he was only 15, Alexander and his brothers began to assist their father when he gave public demonstrations of his visible speech method. Alexander also enrolled as a student teacher in a boys' school near Edinburgh, where he taught music and speech in exchange for other lessons. He was younger than many of his students. After a few years of university study, Bell became a full-time teacher and also taught visible speech to a class of deaf children. In 1866, when Alexander was 19, he carried out a series of experiments to determine how vowel sounds are produced by the human voice. He read a book on acoustics by the German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, who was using electrically powered tuning forks to make vowel sounds. He began to wonder about the idea of what he called telegraphing speech. It was the start of an interest in electricity and sound that would persist for many years and would eventually lead to his greatest invention. A few years after his mind had been sparked by this promising idea of telegraphing sound, Bell became his father's partner in London. While he worked with his father, he also taught at the University of London as a specialist in the anatomy of speech. So far, life for Alexander had been simple and almost predictable. But beginning in 1867, when he was 20, things began to change. Alexander was away on a teaching engagement when he received news his younger brother Edward was sick with consumption, a lung disease we know today as tuberculosis. People knew little about tuberculosis in those days, and most blamed it on the cold, damp climate of England and its smoke-filled cities. They had no medicines to treat it and usually just watched in despair as the patient grew weaker and paler and the cough became deeper and more frequent. Alexander rushed home in time to see his brother, but Edward died shortly after. In his diary, Alexander wrote, "Edward died this morning at 10 minutes to 4 o'clock. He was only 18 years and 8 months old. He literally fell asleep. He died without consciousness and without pain while he was asleep. So may I die." Less than 2 years later, Alexander was again rushing home in response to an urgent letter. This time it was his older brother Melly, the dynamic one, the cheerful one, who always made people laugh. He, too, had tuberculosis. By the time Alexander arrived, Melly was already near death. Alexander said his goodbyes, and Melly took his last breath. As children, Alexander and Melly had made a pact. Whoever died first would try to communicate with the living one, if it could be done. Alexander made several attempts to reach his brother after he died. He held little seances in his room at night all by himself, trying to hear Melly and trying to talk to him. He was not successful. For Alexander Graham Bell, the art of communication was Alexander Graham Bell. Do something useful. That's what the man had said, and young Alexander Graham Bell